Hello and welcome to Mainline Sociology with Joan. And I'm asking you for your forgiveness for my jumping ahead and being really excited about being around people who are fully immersed in Enlightenment thinking. As we were discussing, this dialectic is many things, but it is a way that philosophers and sociologists, Karl Marx in particular, use as a way to describe the movement through time. And as you'll recall, before Marx turned the dialectic on its head, we had Hegel, for one, as an Enlightenment thinker, that, gee, maybe the slaves and the serfs and the peasants have a mind. Maybe they're like us. Maybe we should include them because, after all, alienation exists if even one other person's suffering. If one other person is not experiencing abundance and peace and a movement toward prosperity, then it could ruin the Geist. It could ruin the feeling of the group. It could limit the spirit of God and the spirit of life within us. Well, that kind of thinking is the exact reason that our Constitution was created, because the history of our world here in the West had been one of constant one class ruling over another. And in this picture, this is my family, and I know a great deal about how my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother managed to make the decision to endure the hardships that would follow to escape constant bombardment and stealing of their clans' property and the fruits of their labor. Pictured in the settlement picture, and here is my great-great-grandfather, John William, and his wife, Margaret, who were married in Ellon, Scotland. And by that time in 1840, instead of being the son of a clansman, the son of a free people, or trying to be free people, but the crown kept invading and looting everything, as you'll recall. As things settled down, this dignified man, pulled around a man called Lord Aberdeen of Aberdeenshire. Times were not good. There was hardship, and they had a small child. And rumors were all over the place about this new world where all men are created equal, where the government was there for their participation, but the gifts were of life. The government's not going to kill me. Liberty. I can pursue what makes me tick as an individual. And the more passion I put into it, the bigger the contribution is going to be for society, for the community, for the villages around me. So they got on a boat, and it took, I think, 13 days to get over. And Mother, as she was called, wrote about the hardships, the disease, the people who died on the voyage in the first place. And she was scared. I mean, she was leaving everything that she had known, of course, going to a new world in very brutal conditions, and then traveling all the way from the East Coast into the wilderness of Minnesota, where they would find other Scotsmen to build a community with. My great great grandfather, as all the very separated villages were involved with this idea that yes, it is very hard right now for us in the wilderness, very isolated, but we are working for ourselves. We are under a contract with our government, this new government of the United States of America, that we will be free. We will move toward peace and prosperity. We have that freedom and that right and that blessing imbued by the Creator Himself. Now, as time went on, of course, they had children, and these are them. These are great levels, great Aunt Anna, Uncle Owen, and my grandfather. And Peter raised them with these same ideals, not just ideals. Peter was a very involved person, an avid reader, involved in community affairs, and he built his home after he and his wife were married. And they bought this land for gold that Maggie had been endowed with by her family from Wales. It's called a quarter section. It's 160 acres of wilderness, which over the years, Peter and his family cleared the trees, planted crops, raised animals, and more. It was right on this road, which was the only road from Mankato, Minnesota to St. Paul, Minnesota. Now remember, these settlers in the 1840s it's one of many groups, one of many villages. The established villages in Minnesota of our native people were all over the place too, and people got along. I don't know what you think, and we definitely have heard of many stories, but Peter welcomed all visitors into his farm. This was a relatively busy road. This included Native Americans. This included Jews. This included Gypsies, Norwegians, anyone traveling on that road. Pretty soon they knew that they could stop at this farm for some refreshments and some Enlightenment conversations about building this great new nation. in addition to having this place that became known as the thinking place, as someone characterized it in a book, Peter was very involved in township, county, and state government. Every year, he would take one of the children and travel to St. Paul so they too could learn of how people were represented as a larger, in a larger whole, as spelled out by our Constitution. And this became an urgent matter because of some people who claimed to be with the government around Mankato planned and assassinated and massacred Native Americans in the area. That's a very important time, a terrible time, but for Peter, it was a breach of every ideal that he had studied and read about our Constitution and about all men being created equally and having the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There is nothing about that instant, which I won't go into now, but you probably heard of it, that you're allowed to massacre people and you're allowed to hang them. I have also some personal information about that planning and the execution of the execution, because my friend happened to live in the same house that it was planned in Mankato. Separate story. The point is, in addition to these enlightened ideas, they knew, the whole family knew, that their participation was required and welcomed. One of Peter's great friends was a gentleman named Adolf Dane, also from the same village that he lived in. Adolf was a great intellectual Enlightenment thinker, and they would sit around for hours and talk about pursuing their passions. And Adolf Dane had a passion that he pursued and became is and was a very famous artist, many of which, as I'll show you in the next video, were of Peter's farm. And I particularly like this one because it's called Before the Storm. And it has so many meanings, as 4 generations of my people live there and live through various storms. Story for another day. So what happened to these 3 children, and how were they raised? And what kind of influence did Enlightenment thinking, moving toward peace, moving toward participation, keeping the fruits of your labor, participating in community and building the spirit therein? Well, this is his eldest daughter, my Aunt Anna. And as time goes by, she married and moved to another village close by called Cloquet and had a daughter. And a year into when they moved there, there was a huge, huge fire. And to give you an idea, yes, there were little towns and villages all over. Nearly half of eastern, north to south Minnesota burned to the ground. And in this little article, just to give you an overview, and interesting the way it's written, in this most recent of Minnesota's Holocausts, over 8,000 square miles were affected, and approximately 2,000 square miles of territory. Interesting that they're separated that way. Now they talk about how much it hit the lumber business, blah, blah, blah. But right here, these burned sections include all these places. But after they talk about how much lumber they lost, they say farm buildings, settlers, homes, whole villages, one whole city, suburban portions of Duluth, and summer homes or cottages on hunting and fishing lodges. Well, my aunt was incensed. Why? For that very reason. Hey, maybe the government came in and said, oh, we'll help you build another house, because her house burned down, as all her neighbors did. But fine. But she said, what about all the villages? What about the native people? You don't even know how devastated they were. They weren't even listed in the casualties of this. For Anna, this was a betrayal of everything she had ever learned in her entire life. She had been with her father to participate in the government process. She understood the government process, but more, her heart knew that all men are created equal, and when there is a disaster, that the riches of our government should not be only for people in this town or that town. Well, that set a fire in her that frankly no one saw coming. The woman was a powerhouse, and she never stopped talking. She worked on this cause for 17 years. That's not all. But just out of curiosity, I went to Wikipedia, and the Cloquet Fire was an immense forest fire in northern Minnesota. So it's either in northern Minnesota or southern Minnesota. I mean, they're not even giving you a very good picture of where this was. I happen to know how big 8,000 miles of Minnesota was because I lived on the farm too. But it says, I found this interesting. It was caused by sparks on the local railroads and dry conditions. Why did that bother me so much? Because that's what we were told happened in Ventura County when thousands of houses burned down and we endured these wildfires for nearly 8 months a few years ago. What else was interesting to me is the picture that they showed you of the Cloquet Fire, which is, 1 square block. But it's interesting that this fire that was so fierce and so long and killed so many thousands of people, yet it didn't burn trees down. Well, that's just one of those that looks familiar to me today. So you're wondering, how in the world did people communicate back then? What did she do? Did she stand on the street corner and tell everyone that the government was not helping the Native Americans, that it was a massacre of proportions that no one could understand, no one was investigating? Yes, she did that, but she also talked about how this was a betrayal of the very Constitution and the Enlightenment principles of all men are created equal. And yes, she talked in the streets, but there's also this place called the Chatawanga, and she ended up making a living. People would go there and sing and do poetry, and people would come and listen, and it was a very excellent place for community involvement. It was very cultural, and this is how people learned about their world. And these places were all across the nation, but she was in Minnesota, and that's where she talked. Well, she talked and she talked and she talked, and eventually, searching for answers everywhere, not getting them from her representatives in St. Paul, which she addressed that body often. She was very familiar with the road to St. Paul because of her father taking her, and she knew her way around the capital. Lacking any better ideas, she decided to run for United States Senator. She wasn't getting anywhere in the Minnesota House, so let's bump it up. Well, because of her reputation as a fast, passionate talker, a person who would not let this issue of the Native Americans being massacred and left all over the place, every single one of their villages gone. She was the first woman ever nominated by a major party to run for Senate. And she always said, I was never a Democrat, but they're the only people who would have me. And she would laugh about that. And but she didn't win, but she got 110 some thousand votes, and she made a very good run of it, after which bolstered her interest in both continuing to speak on tours wherever it would take her, and also in Washington. Just to jump ahead, this had a profound effect on my father as well, because he would tell the story about the time she took him to Washington and plopped him right down on Franklin Roosevelt's desk and went about her business with him. Now, I can attest to that empirically, because spending those summers on the farm, I knew my Aunt Anna, and we would go to a place called the King's Dining Room at St. Olaf College. And we would have a nice dinner. My grandmother would get my sister and I new clothes, and we were always on our best behavior. And then after we ate in the King's Dining Room, she would sit down in the quad and start talking. She would just start talking, and pretty soon a group was surrounding her. She was very comfortable with herself because she was raised to be who she was, to follow her passion, to be an American. So she could opine about the betrayals of her government, but she would always end what her diatribe was about with, but yet, I would rather be wrapped in the American flag than wear the robes of royalty. She was truly an enlightened thinker. This fire also had an impact on the way that Adolf Dane began to draw. And there are many lithographs and watercolors that he did of that fire. I just wanted to show you an example right here. This was like a war in their peaceful, once peaceful Enlightenment time. And my great grandfather and Adolf Dane were both starting to question, why is the government killing the native people? Are we going to be next? I mean, they're not. Just because they didn't have computers, it doesn't mean they didn't understand what was going on. But it was concerning, but they still had this enlightened ideas. Well, because of the devastation of that fire, a new industry was born: insurance. Everyone in Minnesota and the surrounding states knew by then that should a fire come and get you, you know what? You can't rely on the government to help you rebuild. Look what happened to the native people. Look what happened to the dead and the farmers in the outlying vast regions of the wilderness. So Uncle Owen became an insurance salesman, and he was very good at it. He'd have conversations, and he learned from his big sister. He knew how to talk to people too, and so did his father. So devastatingly handsome and wickedly intelligent, he drove from farm to farm and sold insurance and became very successful. His brother as well. They were so successful, he'd say, that he could afford to drive a Cadillac, but he would always buy an Oldsmobile because he didn't want the poor farmers to think that he was coming in just to take some of their money. People had a memory. Remember, in Europe, if you had something as a farmer, the nobles would ride in and take some. And he was wise enough to know that in a way he was doing the same thing. Because his great-grandfather served in the Civil War, his whole childhood and life, he was very interested in the Civil War and why something like that would happen under the kind of constitution or contract that we have for don't kill me. There's a lot that he had a lot of questions. So when my father was young, they'd take trips, and all their trips in the summertime in his Oldsmobile, we would stop at different Civil War um, battles. He'd study them, he'd pick up books, he'd talk to the people around there and find out what they remembered. And this went on for years. My dad said it's basically how he learned about history, how he learned about the culture of the United States, and how he'd watch. Well, I can't really speak for Owen's motivation, but in his later life, he started writing under a pen name called, his name was Adam Lair. And maybe you can see where he was going with it. I think he found a little cynicism on his history trips in his life, what his sister was doing. He'd often accompany her on her travels to Washington and the Capitol. So, just saying, um, he did marry later in life, but he never had children. He wasn't interested in that. His brother, my grandfather, was a little bit different. He was the youngest child, and he was sort of more of a romantic, sort of more of an observer than Anna and Owen were. And he was interested in settling down. Even though he was older, he was successful, but he wanted to go back to the farm that his father had built and start a life with someone. And the someone is my grandmother. Her name's Martha, and that's a whole other family history. Very, very interesting as well. I knew that my grandmother and so grandmother and grandfather loved each other because I lived on the farm, and so all of the documentation and things that everyone had saved were still there. So sometimes I'd sit and read their correspondence and their love letters that they wrote to each other when they were courting. And there was a great deal of respect I witnessed between them as I spent the summers there and eventually moved into the farm and lived there for a decade. The same thing happened when I was looking for the pictures and I was finding everything, and I got kind of sidetracked reading the letters again after all these years. And I found a dialectic right in the first paragraph of one of his letters to her, and I'd like to read it to you. Dearest Martha, your letter just came today, and I surely was glad to get it. I'm just wondering now whether I can come down there tomorrow. If I'll do, I'll have to come back soon. But I can't wait to see you and see you so badly. I haven't written because I didn't get your letter. It seems to take a week to exchange one letter, and you know, I just about have to wait for an answer before writing any more letters. So the letter itself becomes what Martha said and then he gets back to her, and that's an ongoing dialectic. Love can be a dialectic. It's a conversation, and it's moving toward peace, and it's moving toward creation. And create they did. They had my dad. And the real reason that I started digging out pictures was because this is the picture that I see when I think of the four generations before me. My great grandfather and my dad, and how he imbued my own dad with the same idealism, or better said, enlightened viewpoint it wasn't an ideal. It wasn't an ideal. It was the way they lived. And I hope that you can see that despite everything, despite the contract that the government and the people were to have through the Constitution and the fightings of the Civil War, they saw by now of the trouble in maintaining that liberty, maintaining even their lives. But they adapted, and society grew, and the dialectic of time moved on. By this time, academics had full on had its teeth in this flipped dialectic, calling Enlightenment thinking the idea that a person can self-govern, that a passion of creation could be a contribution to society, and flipped it on its head. No, that doesn't matter. There is no mind. There are beasts, and we will decide what's good for them. I'm just saying that that's the way it's it's playing out, but it's a secret because no one really knew then what was coming.